Hi, my name is Nikhil Jacob and I am a trainee doctor living and working in Ireland. Given that the vaccines against the coronavirus are being rolled out across the world, I thought it might be a good idea to look at some of the relevant points to better inform our decision-making regarding the vaccines. As a Catholic and someone who's pro-life, I'll specifically be focusing on some of the moral objections that people have to the vaccine. What we will not be looking at is the medical and scientific side of things, because that's not within the scope of this video, but I will leave links at the bottom for those who might want to explore that side of things in greater detail. As you might know, vaccines work by introducing our body's immune system to some part of a pathogen, which can be a bacterium or a virus in this case, in order to generate an immune response from the body. This is done so that if you're ever actually infected by the virus of the disease, your body's immune system is already prepared because it recognizes the pathogen from the time it was vaccinated, so that when you get infected, your immune system is ready to combat and fight off that infection. You can see how this would be extremely beneficial in the current climate with the pandemic roaring across the world. So then what is the objection that a lot of people have to the vaccine? Part of the vaccine research and development process involves using cells that come from cell lines. These cell lines can come from a variety of sources, such as monkeys, hamsters, insects, etc. The moral objection comes from the use of cell lines that were derived from aborted human fetuses who were aborted in the 1960s and 1970s. And since any vaccine that uses such cells have an immoral or illicit origin, many Catholics and other pro-life groups worldwide have objected to the development and use of such a vaccine because it involves cooperating in the initial evil act of abortion. So how are we to approach this issue and inform our decision? The Church's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith released a statement in December 2020, which is helpful in guiding our thoughts on the matter. But before we look at that statement, I think it would be helpful to take a step back and look at a couple of moral theology terms, nothing too fancy. So we know that in daily life, we can have varying degrees of cooperation with evil. Let's take the example of a pizza delivery guy whom you tip $10. The pizza delivery guy takes the $10 home and gives it to his son, who then uses that money to, let's say, buy drugs. You can see that even without intending or even approving of it, both me and the pizza delivery guy have some sort of cooperation with that evil act of drug use. But clearly, these are remote or distant cooperations with the evil. And you can see that my cooperation with that evil is more distant or more remote than the pizza delivery guy's cooperation with evil. All you have to remember here is one's cooperation with an evil act can be proximate or close to the evil act, in which case you have a greater moral responsibility. Or your cooperation with evil can be distant or remote from the initial evil act, in which case you'd have a lesser moral responsibility. With that in mind, let's look at 5 of the 6 points that the CDF statement says, which are most relevant to us. Of course, these points are paraphrased because the original quotations from the document would be too long to include in this video. Point number 1. There are differing degrees of responsibilities between the people who decide to use the aborted fetal cells in the development of the vaccine versus those who have no voice in it. So the people who decided to use the aborted fetal cells, such as the initial researchers and the pharmaceutical companies, would have a greater moral responsibility than the person, the individual at the end of the line who's receiving the vaccine in the face of grave danger and has no other options available to him. Point number 2. When ethically acceptable vaccines are not available in your region for whatever reason, be it infrastructure or just not having received approval yet, for whatever reasons, if ethically acceptable vaccines are not available in your region, it is acceptable to receive COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses in their research and production process. This is perhaps the most relevant and perhaps the most divisive of the points. So just to read it again, when ethically acceptable vaccines are not available, it is morally acceptable to receive COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses. Point number 3 outlines that the reason for saying that, for the individual receiving the vaccine in the face of grave danger, their cooperation with the initial act of abortion is remote or distant. So because they are in grave danger, which the pandemic appears to be, and they have no alternatives, it is acceptable for them to receive the vaccine because their cooperation with the initial act of abortion is remote. Therefore, if the vaccine is deemed safe and effective, the vaccine may be used in good conscience. This point, however, emphasizes that this is not even indirectly an endorsement or legitimation of the practice of abortion. The 4th point further stresses this point, as it says that the use of such vaccines does not and should not be taken to mean that there is an endorsement of the use of cell lines from aborted fetuses, and encourages pharmaceutical companies and governments to produce ethically acceptable vaccines. The last point states that vaccination is not a moral obligation and is therefore voluntary. So if people wish to refuse to take the vaccine because of reasons of conscience and say that they don't want any cooperation, however remote, with abortion, they are free to do so. But the point reminds them that they still ought to take other precautions to protect others who may be weak and exposed to the virus, and you should therefore not become channels of transmission of the virus. So where does that leave us? The many vaccines that are being distributed or developed worldwide against COVID-19 can be divided into 3 broad categories. Number 1, vaccines that do not use abortion-derived cell lines at all, in any phase. Number 2, those that do not use abortion-derived cell lines in the manufacturing phase, but do use them at some other stage of development, for example, in the testing phase. And number 3, those vaccines that use abortion-derived cell lines in more than one phase of development, especially in the manufacturing phase. So we can see that ethically, Category 1 is the most ideal, as there are no moral objections against it. Category 2 is less ideal than Category 1, but is ethically more acceptable than Category 3 vaccines. With that in mind, let's look at some of the vaccines that are currently or will soon be in use. At the time this video is being made, there are no Category 1 vaccines available anywhere in the world. The 2 most used vaccines, certainly here in Ireland, are the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines. Both are Category 2, which means that they have not used abortion-derived cell lines in their manufacturing phase. In fact, both of them being mRNA vaccines, they haven't used any cells at all in the manufacturing phase. But both have used abortion-derived cell lines in the testing phase. The AstraZeneca Oxford University vaccine is a Category 3, which means that both in its manufacturing phase and testing phases, it has used abortion-derived cell lines. Therefore, as per the Church's statement, if there is a Category 1 vaccine available, that would be the ideal. But in its absence, in the face of grave danger, a Category 2 vaccine would be morally acceptable. And in the absence of both 1 and 2, even Category 3 vaccines, in the face of grave danger, are morally acceptable for use. Of course, this is just a brief intro, and much more can be said about the topic. My exploration of the moral theology behind it was perhaps brief and simplistic. Some people would argue that the current pandemic does not pose a grave enough danger to justify the use of such vaccines. Others would contend that even if it did, they still would want no participation with such a vaccine that involves abortion-derived cell lines. Either way, because there's much more to be said, I hope that this video was helpful for you to get at least a brief overview of the situation. I'll leave links below to help you dive more into this topic, including a link to the Charlotte Lozier Institute's article containing a list of the various COVID-19 vaccine candidates, so that you can check what category the vaccine in your region belongs to. And I hope that these help you make an informed decision on the topic.